Chapter 13, the second half of our presentation, we will be discussing spinal cord physiology. The spinal cord has two principal functions. The white matter tracts are highways that will conduct nerve impulses to and from the brain. The gray matter will receive and integrate the excitatory postsynaptic potentials and the inhibitory postsynaptic potentials, so the incoming and the outgoing information to perform spinal reflexes. All right, we have sensory and we have motor tracts. So here we're showing the principal sensory and motor tracts in the spinal cord. The two principal sensory tracts are the spinothalamic tract and the posterior column tract, whereas the two motor tracts that we will talk about are the direct pathways and the indirect pathways. Just know these names. We will go over more details about them in a later chapter. But the sensory information from the receptors travels up the spinal cord to the brain along two main routes on each side of the cord. We said these two routes are the spinothalamic tract and the posterior column tract. The motor information travels from the brain down the spinal cord to the effectors, whether that's muscles or glands, along two types of descending tracts, direct pathways and indirect pathways. As I said, just know the names of these sensory and motor tracts here, the spinothalamic tract, posterior column tract, and then the direct pathways, indirect pathways. And in chapter 16, we will discuss these in more detail. Remember that sensory will be ascending and motor will be descending. The spinal cord serves as an integrating center for spinal reflexes. These spinal reflexes occur in the gray matter. A reflex is a fast, predictable, automatic response to changes in the environment that helps maintain homeostasis. Reflexes may be spinal and cranial in location and somatic or autonomic in function. So we will talk about our reflex arc. You have some great interactions and animations here for these as well. If you use the presentation from Canvas, download it, and then if you're connected to the internet and in slideshow mode on your own computer, you can run this. But these are also the same animations that are available by just going in Canvas, finding chapter 13, and then going to the 13.7 section and looking for the animations and information that's available from Wiley+. All right, so the general components of your reflex arc. There are 5 general components, and a reflex arc is the simplest type of pathway. Pathways will be specific neuronal circuits and thus will include at least one synapse. The 5 functional components of a reflex arc are the sensory receptor, the sensory neuron, the integrating center, the motor neuron, and finally the effector. So these reflexes will help to maintain homeostasis by permitting the body to make exceedingly rapid adjustments to homeostatic imbalances. So let's talk through this reflex arc. The sensory receptor on the dendrite of a sensory neuron or an association sensory structure will respond to a stimuli, whether that's internal or external, and it will produce a generator potential. If this generator potential reaches, of course, threshold, that will lead to depolarization and will trigger one or more impulses in the sensory neuron to propagate along the axon to axon terminals in the gray matter of the spinal cord or brainstem. Here, relay neurons, or the interneuron, will send nerve impulses to an area of the brain that will allow conscious awareness of that a reflex has occurred. So in the integrating center, which is in the gray matter, it has a synapse between the sensor and the motor neurons. If we have this one synapse between the sensory and the motor neurons, it is said to be monosynaptic. However, more often, there is more than one interneuron that is involved in relaying the message to other interneurons, and then finally to a motor neuron in the central nervous system. And so, therefore, it's said to be polysynaptic because it had more than one place that it synapsed. Finally, though, whether it's monosynaptic or polysynaptic, that impulse is transmitted to the motor neuron, which will carry the impulse out of the central nervous system to part of the body that will respond, or the effector. The effector will be a muscle or a gland, and the action is to create a reflex that can be our skeletal muscle, somatic reflex, or it can be our smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or gland, which would be an autonomic or a visceral reflex. So we have some common vocabulary terms here for our reflex arcs: ipsilateral and contralateral. So on what side of the synapse will we occur? So ipsilateral means that the sensory impulse will enter the spinal cord on the same side from which the motor neuron will leave. All monosynaptic impulses are ipsilateral. So ipsilateral, the sensory impulse enters the spinal cord on the same side from which the motor will leave. So here we showed a ipsilateral because we are on the same side of the spinal cord. Now, if we were to have our sensory neuron enter on this side and our motor neuron exit on the opposite side, that would be contralateral. And then, of course, we've already discussed monosynaptic and polysynaptic, meaning how do we go from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron, or do we have other interneurons in between? And then reciprocal innervation. All right, we have several different somatic spinal reflexes. They include the stretch reflex, tendon reflex, flexor or withdrawal reflex, and the cross extensor reflex. Excuse me. All of these are examples and exhibit reciprocal innervation. All right, so the stretch reflex here. The stretch reflex is ipsilateral. So we see it's on the same side. Our sensory enters and our motor exits on the same side of the brain or spinal cord. And so it's ipsilateral, and it is important in maintaining muscle tone and muscle coordination during exercise. It is a 2-neuron or motor synaptic reflex arc containing one sensory neuron and one motor neuron. An example here is the knee-jerk reflex, like that at the doctor's office. So you see here they are applying a stimulus to the knee, and you see the foot will have the contraction of the muscle, or the foot will move because of the contraction of the muscle here in the thigh. This operates as a feedback mechanism to control muscle length by causing muscle contraction. The tendon reflex is also ipsilateral, so we're entering with our sensory response on one side and exiting on the same side. And it prevents damage to muscles and tendons as a result of stretching. It operates as a feedback mechanism to control muscle tension by causing muscle relaxation when the muscle force becomes too extreme. The flexor withdrawal reflex is also ipsilateral, as you see, and it is a protective withdrawal reflex that moves a limb to avoid pain. So I've actually almost cut off here. Here there is a small tap on the ground that the person is about to step on, and so this flexor withdrawal reflex is pulling the leg back so that they that sensory from the tack almost going into the foot causes to draw our leg back, and so that's this reflex here. And then finally, the crossed extensor reflex. When we pull our foot back and withdraw the foot from stepping on that tack or that sharp object, we then want to keep our balance to make sure we don't fall over. And so oftentimes we end up crossing our legs, and this is the crossed extensor reflex. So the flexor we said was going to be the flexor withdrawal reflex was ipsilateral and protective to avoid pain. It was a contraction of the flexor muscles to move the limb away and avoid the injury. And then this crossed extensor reflex, it's to balance maintaining reflex that causes a synchronized extension of the joints of one limb and then flexion of the joints in the opposite limb. Now this one, instead of ipsilateral, it is actually contralateral. So we see here that the sensory neuron enters on one side, but the motor or the effector exits on the opposite side of the spinal cord. Oftentimes we use reflexes to diagnose disorders of the nervous system and to locate injured tissue. If a reflex is absent or abnormal, then the damage may be somewhere along a particular conduction pathway. So some important reflexes include the patellar reflex, the Achilles reflex, Babinski reflex, abdominal reflex, and the pupillary reflex. We'll finish up the chapter, as we do all, with disorders and homeostatic imbalances. So traumatic injuries, the damage that can result from a traumatic injury, of course, will depend on the degree of the spinal cord section and the degree of or the degree of compression and the segments that are involved. If we have complete transection, it will result in paralysis in a variety of forms. Lesser effects can include incomplete paralysis to loss of sensation and motor function. Spinal shock often occurs immediately after an injury or traumatic injury and is associated with swelling. And so that's oftentimes while we will administer corticosteroids, because we can reduce that swelling and hopefully reduce the degree of compression on the segments involved. Hemisection is a partial transection of our spinal cord. And of course, as far as the plegia goes, or the paralysis goes here, mono, para, hemi, quadra, just terms that relate to how many or where. Spinal cord compression can result from fractured vertebrae, herniated intervertebral disc, tumors, osteoporosis, or infections. Degenerative diseases, we talked about multiple sclerosis in the chapter before, and multiple sclerosis is considered a degenerative disease of the spinal cord. Shingles is also an acute infection of the peripheral nerves caused by the herpes zoster virus. So oftentimes if you have had chickenpox, this virus will lay dormant and then it can come back as the herpes zoster virus. The virus will migrate down peripheral nerves, causing pain, skin discoloration, and then the characteristic line of skin blisters. So, whichever nerve that the virus migrates down, what that area of the skin that it innervates on the dermatome that we showed in the first lecture, that would be where that characteristic line of skin blisters would be. Oh, let me go back in. We have one more. Excuse me. Okay. There we go. Technical difficulties. And then the last one is poliomyelitis, which is also, of course, commonly referred to as polio. Another name for it is infantile paralysis. So we don't hear polio a lot anymore, but polio is a viral infection characterized by fever, headaches, a stiff neck and back, deep pain and weakness, and then a loss of certain somatic reflexes. So oftentimes paralysis will occur once the virus has destroyed the motor neuron cell bodies. So it's a good thing that we have been able to pretty much eradicate polio, because it did cause, it was a viral infection that caused paralysis of, that destroyed the motor neuron cell bodies, leading to paralysis. I will be posting some more videos about the reflex arc for you, as well as each individual reflex. Please make sure with the types of reflexes that we talked about that you are able to describe them in terms of monosynaptic or polysynaptic, and that you are also able to know if they're ipsilateral or contralateral. And remember, of course, they all showed reciprocal innervation.